so much of a sermon this morning as it is a reading. But I begin with the same prayer you guys can probably recite it as well as I've learned. Will you pray with me? God of Christmas Eve, God of holy moments, God of morning services. May these words simply be enough this morning. May the words of my mouth, meditations of our collective hearts be enough. God, our strength, our hope, and our return. Amen. So, when I began, I was going to write something this morning, and I was, people use the word blessed a lot, particularly pastors and church folks, but I was lucky this week to be on a Zoom call. Some of us called in, some of us video conferenced in with my sort of friend, Shane Claiborne from your neck of the woods, Michelle. He's in Philly, running this intentional community. I am in awe of Shane's work. There's no other word for it, but he hosted a book club, and I think a book reading with Diana Butler Bass. And I think one of the gifts, and I say gifts because there's very few things that COVID has gifted us with, but authors, instead of doing these, whirlwind book tours, have done so many Zoom book releases and book tours. And as an avid reader, and I have been since I actually learned how to read, I was a late bloomer with reading. And I don't know how many times I've shared with you all, but they called it chapter 1. It was not very sensitive when I learned how to read, but when you first learn chapter books, it's kind of a big deal. But I was a late bloomer with reading, and they can't hear. Well, supposedly when I stand up here, y'all can hear better. They called it chapter 1 reading, which is highly insensitive to a late bloomer reader because you are in chapter 1, which is, in a chapter book, that's that first chapter. But I got to be in Diana Butler Bass's book reading for us. And I found this wonderful excerpt from her book that I think is just perfect for this morning. I'm going to read it to you. She writes, he's not a friend of mine. So when I read this, she says, a friend of mine, Scottish writer John Philip Newell, and I'm familiar with his writing as well, but I'm not friends with him. So Scottish writer John Philip Newell often shares the story of being overwhelmed by seeing his newborn grandson for the first time, and how profoundly spiritual the experience was. Ancient Celtic Christians believe that infants come from God, and that gazing in a newborn's face, we see the very image of God. And conversely, through the infant's eyes, in some mysterious way, God also beholds us. The birthing place is sort of an inner sanctum where we encounter the freshly born presence of God. No wonder that Christian tradition makes much of the birth of Jesus. The one whose birthplace opens to angels, animals, shepherds, and shamans. It is more than the silent midnight holiness between Mary and her son. The whole cosmos witnesses the birth. More than an image fresh from heaven, the infant is the very embodiment of the divine. Every birth is echoed in this birth. No wonder the stars fill the heavens, the light shines forth, the presence of God made manifest, the glory of the one from the womb of the grace, darkness of birth, light of the world. Very truly, I tell you, says Jesus, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. Born from above is the phrase that some Christians translate born again. she, woman, and I'll say birthing people because we're an open and affirming congregation. So birthing people will be saved through childbearing, says one of the letters written in Paul's name. Women understand this transformation through new birth and all its tenderness, the freshness of God's presence come into this world. This was true for me and mysteriously, painfully true for one of my best friends, Teresa, whose son was stillborn. Even with the sadness and grief of simultaneous birth and death, she felt it too. God's presence was in the midst of the worst day of our lives. They will call him Emmanuel. And I want us to ponder this even amidst some of the worst days of our lives with COVID-19, grief and loss. God is with us even during these worst days of our lives, divorce and loss, impending doom, debt. Years later, we shared our memories of those days. Birth, she said knowingly, is so transformative. What is born of this flesh is flesh, said Jesus with more than a little irony. And we're going to talk about this upcoming Sunday because Jesus ages quite a bit by Sunday. What is born of the Spirit is spirit, in John 3. Everyone is born of both flesh and spirit. The problem is that we forget this. I was born into this world. I'd been born again at 15, and then I got born again and again when giving birth some 2 decades later. Do not be astonished that I said to you, Jesus reminded his friends, you must be born from above. Jesus, the birthed one, is also ever birthing presence, calling new life from the womb of God into the world. Not once, but many times. So that's why we as Christians come from this space as birthed ones to be born again and again, to grieve again and again, to give new life again and again, to be reborn again and again, and to experience this again and again. We get to witness this not just on Christmas, because if we only experience it on Christmas Eve, there's something lost in this message. There's something lost here if we're only witnessing it here. Just like here, if we only experience it on Sundays, if we don't do anything about this table moment, there's something lost. And if we don't do anything about this birthing moment, this rebirth, this experiential moment, this witness moment, this possible moment, we've missed the message. We've missed the opportunity to go out into the world and share the gospel. And what's the point? What's the point? If we unwrap the gift and we do nothing with it. And to me, that's the problem. That's the problem. We read this, I don't know where, we read this, and I believe it. Like, I believe it in my innermost being. I believe it with everything in me. I've been changed by it. And if I do nothing with it, that's the problem, right? And I can argue to the end of whether I believe in a historical Jesus. That's on y'all to decide. Like disciples, I talk about whether being a disciple, Beth and I had this discussion the other day. There's a wide berth for all of you sitting in here and all of you on Zoom of what we believe, right? The point is that we do something with it. And for each of us, we might believe something different. But collectively, we're called to do something with that belief. We all believe something. And the story matters. And my hope is that we go do something with that story. And we're changed enough by it that we change, somebody that I know and love very well, Greg Ellison III, has been a mentor to me. And he has kind of this metaphor for living that I think his grandmother talked to him about changing the world. And he talks about changing the 3 feet around him because the world is so big. My hope is that we change our 3 feet, and then those people change their 3 feet and those people change their 3 feet. And the Jesus story is about changing those 3 feet, right? That's how the gospel becomes infectious. I think it's kind of how COVID becomes infectious. Right? It's 6 feet, right? And we got to be just as impactful as COVID with our gospel, right? And the birth story is about being at least a little bit on fire with the Jesus story. And it's got to be more than just on Christmas Eve. And the wilderness story has weighed us down enough that I feel like we're in the mud. And hopefully the birth story can lighten us and give us some levity to where we can take that gift out into the world. Amen, y'all.
Amen.